Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about characteristics of life. Here's a little thought experiment. You don't have to do this, but you can pause if you want. And if I asked you to make a list of characteristics that are required for something to be considered living. At first, that sounds like a pretty easy thing to do because you just kind of know when you see something if it's alive or not. You don't feel like you have to know too much about it. But it gets a little more difficult because one, living things can be really, really different. Whatever's on your list has to be true for you, as well as a fungus, as well as a bacterium, as well as a house plant, because those things are all alive. So the characteristics have to apply to all of them. But it's also tricky because there are a lot of things that are not alive that can appear to be if you're not careful. And if you don't write your list very specifically, then you might accidentally include one of those other things. So here's an example of that. This is a picture of a fire. And no, fire is not alive. I'm not trying to tell you fire is, but it has lots of characteristics that might kind of make it look like it's alive. It needs oxygen just like you do. It can grow just like you do. You could make an argument that fire can even reproduce if you split it in two. Now you have two fires, and then they can both grow and they can split as well. Um, and no, that doesn't mean that fire is alive, but it can do lots of things that living things can, which makes it a little tricky. So here we got a bear and a fish. The bear's alive. The fish is alive. They have some things in common. Maybe the fish isn't going to be alive for too long. But how about the river they're standing in? So, no, rivers aren't alive, but rivers can develop, they can change, they could grow, they could split. So, we need to make sure that whatever list of characteristics we comes up with is going to include things like the bear and the fish and fungi and trees and bacteria and all of that, but exclude things like a river and a fire that may be or that are non-living. So here's some pictures of bacteria, just to remind you that yeah, they're alive too. So our list has to include them, but exclude all those other things. So first of all, a little background on living things. Over time and observation, scientists have found that all living things have certain characteristics. We call those the characteristics of life. And this is kind of like I don't know, thousands of years of observation and trial and error and looking at different things and deciding what's alive and what's not, is sort of how we got to the point we are in today. The word organism means anything that has all of these characteristics, or at one point in its life did have all these characteristics, even if one of them or a couple of them might have been lost. It has them at some point. So to be alive, you need all of these characteristics. Even if you're missing one, does means that you are non-living. Now that doesn't apply if you had it at one point and lost it. All organisms are made of cells, one or more cells. That's our first characteristic. Um, and this will be a really important one. Cells are the basic unit of life. And you probably already knew this, but some living things only have one cell. So that's the first characteristic of life, has to include cells. Anything that's living has at least one cell, and that's something that all living things have in common. Second characteristic displays organization. So all of biology is based on different levels of organization. We've already seen a little bit of that in our studies of biochemistry. So starting with individual atoms. Atoms have organization because they've got protons and neutrons and electrons. But when you take those atoms and combine them, you can get compounds and molecules, bigger things. When you take those molecules and arrange them a specific way, you can get biological organization. So that can be really simple, like arranging the molecules so that you have a membrane in a cell, or you can be arranging lots and lots of cells to make tissues and organ systems and things that are much more complex. But all living things, from the simple to the really complex, are going to show some form of organization, some form of complexity that you wouldn't otherwise see in non-living things. Going along with that is the idea of structure and function. So the function of a particular structure or level of organization is based on how it is arranged. Next, living things grow and develop. So growth means you're getting bigger in some sense. So you're adding mass, whether that's a cell itself getting bigger or multicellular organisms, cells dividing and adding more cells. Living things show some sort of growth. And then development means things are getting more complex. So it could be different abilities or just more and more complexity as that growth process happens. Next, living things have to be able to reproduce. There are lots of different ways that that can happen, but as long as a whatever you're looking at has the ability to pass on genetic information to the next generation, that would be information stored in DNA somehow. That counts as reproduction. And that's really important because if reproduction isn't possible, obviously a species is going to go extinct. Next characteristic is it has to be able to respond to stimuli. That doesn't always have to be like a conscious organism level response. It can be something that's regulated by chemistry or internal processes as well. There are two types of stimuli that organisms might see, internal and external stimuli. So, internal stimuli is going to be anything that is going on within the organism, changing body conditions. And we feel those on a big level in things like being hungry or tired or thirsty. That's an internal stimulus that's prompting an external response. Or we can respond to external things, whether you like hear a loud noise and get scared or see something and you're not sure what it is, don't know how to react. But even more simple organisms that don't have as highly developed systems as we do still respond to stimuli. Bacteria will grow, and some of them will even move toward or away from light. And there are lots of other ways that simple organisms can respond to stimuli on simple chemical levels as well. Next, living things require energy. Energy is required to make everything happen in a cell. So all the chemical reactions, they're pretty much all regulated by enzymes, but they still need energy to make them happen. So living things need energy. Organisms will either take in food from an outside source by eating something else, some other organism, or they'll make their own food through processes like photosynthesis. There's actually another way called chemosynthesis that organisms can make their own food, but we won't worry about that for a couple weeks. Next is homeostasis. And if that's a new word for you, homeostasis means keeping internal conditions within a set range or like a sort of happy place, sort of like a Goldilocks. You want to keep things relatively stable. They can change a little bit, but if they get too far out of a certain range, living things have some way, either behavioral or physiological or chemical, of bringing that balance back to the ideal location. Some of those are ones that are not even conscious choices or behaviors, like when your body heats up and starts sweating to cool down. That's one way you can maintain your temperature within that happy range to keep homeostasis happening. Next, living things need to evolve over time or have adaptations. And this is kind of confusing. People get tripped up on the word adaptation quite a bit because they usually think about like an individual organism learning to do something new or adapting to a new set of circumstances. But that's not what we mean when we use that word. We'll study that a whole lot more detailed second semester. But here, when we talk about adaptations, we're talking about inherited characteristics within a species that help that species survive. So anything that's considered living has to have some characteristics that help it survive that are inherited, that you can trace to changes in their DNA. Short version of that, living things can evolve. And that's true. Sometimes that evolution is quick, sometimes it's slow, but you will see that in anything that's living, a change over time in the species. So to go back to the question from a couple minutes ago, fire is still not alive, but what are some qualities that appear to make it alive? Well, you could argue pretty well that it definitely uses energy. It can grow. You could say it reproduces. Um, Maybe you could argue it maintains homeostasis, maybe not. But it has several things on that list. But the key thing is, what are some reasons fire is not alive? All you need is one. If you can find one thing on that list that fire never has, then it's not alive. I think the easiest way to answer that question is with cells. So fire, not made of cells. It's a chemical reaction, and there are lots of things that make it maybe appear to be alive. But if we can say, nope, fire is not made of cells, it's non living. Same thing with all the other qualities on the list. If you're ever not sure if something is living, all it needs is one quality that it doesn't have for us to consider it non-living. All right, that's a pretty rough overview of those characteristics. If you have any questions, let me know. You'll get to practice using these on the questions on the very next page. So don't forget to flip back to either the presentation or your notes as you're working on that. And let me know if you have any questions. See ya.